Dr. Barad, my young friends, faculty members, all of you who are here. Now this is, as Dr. Barad said, a very memorable occasion. Because, it's the beginning of a process that leads you into the heart of life. I would think of education in that way. I would think of anything that we do as a very resourceful occasion. And I'm so glad that I could be here today to share some moments with you. Now I don't know what to talk to you about, but that all of us are here makes us share one thing. And that one thing is literature. In my case, it's poetry, which I brought over here. So because primarily I write, I would like to talk a little about writing. And writing is what matters very much to me, as to all other persons who write in the world. Now I write poetry, as a matter of fact, and poetry hasn't been a very easy subject for me to write. When one finishes a poem, for example, and goes over to another poem, it becomes a struggle, a real struggle for the poet to sit down and begin his poem and come to its end, which is again a very difficult process. Now when one writes, one is just not aware that he is doing something concrete, or making a poem, or creating it. But he knows that what he is going to do, this creation, it must be received. It must be shared by somebody for whom he is writing the poem. How does one receive? How does one get this gift, except perhaps by supplication? In other words, does he receive it by creating within himself this begging bowl to which the gift is drawn? It would not be wrong to assume that there are few writers who have not had the sense that some element in their work comes to them from a source they do not control. Actually, a person who writes begins to write something, but he or she doesn't know from where the next line is coming from. It's something mysterious that is there. It's something very strange that the writer himself doesn't know what and where the words or the theme or the feeling is coming from. That's very mysterious for a writer. Maybe something really happens to a poet. I speak only for myself. When he has written a good poem, and a good poem is the most difficult thing to do. At such a moment, and again I'm talking about myself, at such a moment one is sitting down to write a poem, I feel both empty and full. I like to be alone at first, and yet not entirely alone, but with that living, invisible presence that is there inside of me. And I would like to run to the bank of the secluded river where I spent the early years of my life and hold the silent cry of the sky and of the water pressed to my heart. If there are tears in the eyes then it is some meaningful form, a form that love might take, or annihilation, or death. And maybe I feel I am being pulled under the warm waters of the river where I grew up and spent my early years. A very important American poet, very significant poet who is no longer dead, and whom I had the pleasure to meet and spend some time, was Allen Ginsberg, who talked about this gift in relation to the poet's creation, as to how he creates and what is there underneath the writing of a poem. The gift will come to you only when, I quote, it means abandoning being a poet, abandoning your careerism, abandoning even the right idea of writing any poetry, really abandoning, giving up as hopeless, abandoning the possibility of really expressing yourself to the world. That means you should forget you are sitting down to do or create or write something for us all. Abandoning the idea of being a prophet with honor and with dignity, and abandoning the glory of poetry and just settling down in the muck or in the litter of your own mind. You really have to make a resolution just to write for yourself. And that is what I think anybody should do. A beginning writer, maybe a professional writer, or a mature writer who has come to the end of his work. He must have to see to himself, promise to himself that he is writing only in the sense of not writing to impress himself, but just writing what the self or his conscience or the voice deep inside him is saying. And this is a very important thing to do. That to forget, in other words, to forget that he is doing something or writing something, doing something new in words and in feelings. To approach words for a poem is more an act of worship. Writing a poem, for example, for a poet, for a serious poet, is not just sitting down and penning anything he wants. Taking up a dictionary, for example, picking out words and trying to bring them into a particular form or into a form which would please or become a gem-like thing for the world to notice. It's not that. To approach words for a poem is more. I would not say more, it is always an act of worship, of puja, of writing, or submitting your heart or yourself to a higher form that is there outside of you and also inside of you. I suppose a poet, I'm again speaking of all of us writers here, and I suppose a poet goes about this in the manner of a ritual, just like he goes in the manner, he does a simple prayer. He doesn't know what he's saying. He has something to say, but he doesn't know how to say it. But there, sitting down, opening out his heart, bringing out the depths of his mind outside himself, is what he wants to do, to invocate an image, to invocate an image with the words he knows and with the language that he has known. The very use of a word and the associations with other words pushes the poet into the darkened room of the mind, where the poet invariably collides with the phantoms of words, with the ghosts of words, enveloped in their familiar old shrouds, because the words have been used again and again and again for centuries together. And it is in himself to use those words in a different manner, in a feeling that would come out and startle or become a revelation to the reader or to the listener of his words. The unexplored darkness of the room urges him, of this mind room. The unexplored darkness of this mind room urges him on. In actuality, the poet doesn't know what he is going to do or what he is awaiting in the dark. As a matter of fact, when one is writing a poem, any poet would say this, I think, any poet would agree with me, may not fully, but a poet is like entering a dark room here. If you just close the doors and windows of this room, the room becomes dark, isn't it? And there is a door there, maybe there is a door also on the other side of the room, and then the poet, tentatively, very nervously, is entering the room from one side of this, one side of the enclosure. And this is the room of the mind, where he enters gradually, nervously, tentatively through the door, but doesn't know where he is going. And when he enters the door, he is writing the first line of the poem. But after the first line, or after the first two lines, he doesn't know where he is going. It is dark. So, there's something there inside him. The conscience may be, or the little voice inside he has never seen you, never seen in his life, that urges him, pushes him outside, pushes him to go ahead. He takes these steps gradually, one by one. And if the poem comes out to be a successful one, to be a strong and intense one, he can reach the other side of the mind room, where the doorway is, and he can come out with a revelatory experience that makes a good poem. A poem should, startle. It should open up a world of wonder. And the world of wonder comes to him very instinctively, very naturally. He doesn't get it from any dictionary or from any encyclopedia or from the internet. The internet may give him a use of words, but then the revelatory message or the sense of wonder that awaits the poet on the other side of the room is something that only comes to the poet alone. So, as I said, he walks across the mind room, and if the poem is a good one, he comes out successfully to the door on the other end. But if the poem doesn't come out, he is lost in the darkness of the room of the mind. That's what happens to a poet when he writes. And I suppose I'm not wrong. My poet friend here, Ravi, will testify to it, that it is more or less a mysterious process. And there is a sense of mystery in a poem, that he goes on and on to find out who he is, who she is, who the poet is, as he goes on, and the days come one by one to him, and he is learning again to find out what this deep voice inside him is trying to say. And take a break, a little water, please. Sorry, I haven't been well, so please excuse me. Now, I'll talk a little about myself before I finish what I have to say. I was a very restless boy in my youth, and even when I was a child. And my sensuality broke early in my life. This I can very truthfully admit to all of you. But a sense of what life was offering to me lay amidst confusion and ignorance. The outside world took over without my knowing. I began stretching out my hands towards the air, into the wind, into the water, into light, into shadow, because I didn't know what to do, because the world appeared to me to be something where I was lost. And the only thing that seemed to redeem me, to seem to hold me together, as to all of us, I'm here not only talking about myself, but to all of you, my young friends, who are just passing through the period of adolescence, that I began pulling at whatever I saw and what was around me. The waves of affection and solitude set me adrift like a paperboat on the waves of a river. Maybe I was 13 or 14 or 15. And I suddenly realized that my true nature was romantic. Why my true nature? The true nature of every young boy or girl is romantic at that stage of his or her life. There was nothing much to do. As I said, let me talk about myself a bit. There was nothing much to do. My father said, you are good at science, you are good at mathematics. Why don't you read science and mathematics? But my interest was always there in language, in the words of the English language, and that, held me like a sort of glue. I could pick up a word, a new word, and see how that new word could, if it was a noun, it could be turned into an adjective or into something else. It wouldn't remain as a noun all its life. So these words in the English language had a power over me to change them, to alter their meanings. I then began reading the novels of, Edgar Wallace, I don't know, you may not have heard of them, or Walter Scott, or Valentine, and they were very, very interesting. They had so much to tell me, so much I learned from them. And I began to surrender myself to a world far removed from the world in which I lived. It was a different world. It was a world of escapism. It was a romantic world which had no connection with the world I lived in. My father was away all the time, as I wanted to tell you also, to reveal. My mother was also there, and I was the oldest in the family, and there was nobody else there. And I could not get well with my mother. That's very strange. But she being an Indian mother and I being an Indian son, there wasn't that rapport between us. There wasn't that bond or link between us that would make living a partly spiritual thing. It wasn't like that. So I wasn't going on well with my mother. And that made me run away from home 2 times. I ran away from home. I didn't study. I went and slept on the streets of Bombay, and so many things happened. So I was a very restless boy in my youth, and I had an upbringing that most of you would like to have. Anyway, so I came to the stage when I felt that it was only that I loved. It was only myself I loved. It was only me that I loved. If it wasn't myself that I loved, I wouldn't have run away, because I was running away because my mother didn't love me, because I wasn't free in my own home. So I ran away because I wasn't loved with myself, and I realized that. And that was a very significant thing for me. And then a number of questions entered my mind. I didn't know what to do. The impulse came to me to write, because there was nothing else I could do. I was the youngest in my class. I was bullied by my class friends, and this bullying put me into a corner where the only thing I could think of was to borrow a book from the school library or the college library and read during my spare time. And that is how my love for words and for the language increased. And so, the fact is, I was alone. There was loneliness that I could not get out from myself. This loneliness made me seek for solitude. Because I think the only remedy for loneliness is nothing else. No crowd, no friends, but again, something called solitude. And I knew I was alone. But the writing of the poem began to open for me a new ambience, a new world, a new freedom. That is what poetry does, It opens up the world before you. It takes you out, and then it brings you a sort of freedom that you don't get anywhere else. Today, even after writing on for years and years, that ingrained, that instinctive, that inner sadness hasn't left me. I've got all your friendship. Professor Baral called me. He was so good, so gracious to bring me over here. But still, I don't know why, the little sadness that was born to me, that came to me when I was a boy, is still there with me. I am with me, I smile, I say, hello my friends, I'd love to have momos with you. But then, that what would I say, that ecstasy, that flame, that roaring flame of happiness has never come to me. Probably that is what makes a person write. All the great poems in the world talk of poets like Neruda, even Shakespeare. These have all come from inner sadnesses we can't do without. And then I think, what is there in life if you are not sad? The sadness brings you something that is there. You should experience a little sadness. And life, will never leave you. You won't get, if you think, oh, I'll be very happy life, I don't think you will. The sadness will be there. It's there, looking like time. Just like time, goes away, it never is there. But sadness will be always there. It is looking over your shoulder. All the time you are running about, you are playing, or you are having a burger at McDonald's or wherever. That little sadness doesn't leave you. And that sadness goes on, pushes you to your own pursuits, leads you, taking you to your own goals. This sadness, as I said, has never left me. It hasn't still. A child is dwarfed, is subdued by his parents, by his uncles, by his aunts. And as a student by school, I was also the subject of many indignities that I couldn't, throw away. Books were my main haven, as they are still. Today I live alone. even at this old age. But there are only books that help me. Sometimes I switch on the television. But it's only books that take me there. I find a new word and I jump for joy that I found a new word. And I take up my dictionary of difficult words and find out what word is this. Very recently, adults give you a very, a cliche sort of a thing. I picked up the word pusillanimous. Such a heavy, ugly sounding word, but it means beautiful. So things like that, they matter to a poet, to a writer, and I think that he should go on, or she should go on, to take up the language. If you are going to write something, if you are really going to be a writer or a poet, you must pick up the language, take these words and see that you can bring in a twist, new meanings into it. So your poem again becomes a process, an act of novelty. Before I end, I would say today my concern is for the written word, for what I write. The word that speaks of the human condition. For the human spirit is what seems to matter. No less for us in India. You know that even after almost 70 years of independence, we suffer from the same problems that were there 70 years ago. My neighbor, the lady who works for me, who is there, who makes my life comfortable, doesn't have a house to live. If she doesn't have a thatch over her head, she doesn't have, what will I say, 2 good meals a day. She doesn't have a toilet where she can spend some time in ease, with ease. That is what it is today. And it is for a poet not to close his eyes or close her eyes, but to look at the world outside him or her and speak of the human condition that is there, that matters to him. It would not be wrong if I suggest that our way of life is also a way of art. The art of living is founded on rhythm, on giving and on receiving, on ebb and flow, on darkness and light, on life and death. For years we have had our reasons to believe in the view that life is not linear as it is felt in the West, but it has to be lived in a sort of a cycle. Maybe this is what differentiates our different kinds of living. And this is what comes to be, or it also gets into one's own writing. To end, when I started writing poetry in the early 60s, and that was about 50 years back, I never thought of these issues. I was thinking mainly of myself. I was thinking mainly of romantic love, about poetry being nothing else but talking about the love between man and woman, which is not right, which was there for some time, but again, it faded away. The writing of a poem was all that mattered to me then. My feelings then were quite simple. One took up an experience and went on to assimilate it in a poem. With no knowledge of poetry behind me, and with a background of physics, I actually am a science student. I taught physics all my life. With a background of physics, I believe writing could be fulfilled through a sort of discipline that physics had taught me. Here I was wrong. But my poetry rested on a seemingly religious view of life, and this meant the positive acceptance of pain, of suffering, of defeat, of loss, of misfortune that came one's way. I began to write in the manner I experienced living, feeling the wrong, the lie, and the nastiness and the injustice I perceived around me as I perceive today, and could go on to question the existence of God, whom my parents have taught me scrupulously to believe. These were questions I began with when I began writing 50 years ago. The same questions are there still today. I have not found any answers. And even all the religious texts of the world haven't given you any answers that is there beyond the realm of poetry or beyond the realm of physics, for example. This is what I wanted to say, that whatever we do, we should think that we are not alone in this world. We have our neighbors, we have our friends, and if we could, when we could, hold out our hands and share something that we have with our neighbor or with a friend, that would be enough. Poetry writing or writing a novel or a poetry book is not enough. Thank you so much.